What if the exact morals that make you a good person are the very things that guarantee your society will be destroyed?
Yeah, it's an agonizing paradox, isn't it?
It really is.
Because, I mean, most of us operate under this assumption that justice and survival are, on the same team.
Right.
We want to believe that a society survives and thrives because it is just, and that an unjust society will eventually just crumble under the weight of its own iniquity.
Today, we are looking at a deeply controversial essay that argues the exact opposite.
Completely the opposite. Yeah.
We are diving into a political and philosophical text titled Survival and Justice, and the author is presenting a thesis that is, frankly, designed to make you uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
The core argument is that when a nation's absolute, undeniable desire to survive clashes directly with its own moral compass, choosing morality, choosing justice, is essentially a slow, self-inflicted death sentence.
Wow.
And to prove this, the author uses a very specific, highly charged historical case study, which is South Africa and the system of apartheid.
Which means, we are stepping into some extremely volatile historical and political territory here.
We are.
The author is taking a localized history and using it to make these sweeping, almost apocalyptic claims about the modern Western world today.
So before we get into the mechanisms of this essay, I want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener, about what our mission is for this deep dive today.
Very important point to make.
We are acting as your guides through this source material. The text contains highly charged, very specific framings of history, race, theology, and politics.
Extremely specific framings.
And we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the author's viewpoints, and we are not validating the historical claims made in this text.
Right, our role is strictly analytical.
Think of us as cartographers mapping out a very hazardous intellectual terrain. Our job is simply to help you understand the internal logic of the essay, like how the author gets from point A to point B.
Regardless of how controversial or radical those points might be. So to map that terrain, we really have to start with a single haunting question that the author features early in the text.
I remember this quote, yeah.
It functions as the gravitational center for everything that follows. It's a quote from an accomplished Afrikaner poet named N.P. Van Wyck Lowe.
Okay.
The quote is this: "Is it possible for a small volk to survive for long if it becomes hateful in the eyes of the best of its members?"
Let's break that down, because the specific words there really matter.
They do.
A small volk, a people, a nation.
Right.
If it becomes hateful in the eyes of the best of its members, that changes the entire definition of what survival means in the geopolitical sense, I mean.
It totally shifts the perspective.
We usually think of national survival in terms of, military strength, borders, GDP, or resource independence.
The tangible stuff.
Right. But this quote shifts the battlefield entirely inward. The author is suggesting that the real threat to a nation isn't an invading army.
No, it's something else entirely.
It is a loss of internal moral conviction. If the most intelligent, the most moral, the most capable people within your society look at the mechanisms keeping that society alive and feel disgusted, what happens?
And the author's answer to that is that the society simply gives up.
It just surrenders.
Basically, it suffers a kind of spiritual exhaustion.
Sure.
And to illustrate how this happens, the text takes us back to the establishment of political apartheid in 1948.
Okay, let's unpack this.
But the author doesn't start with the laws or the policies, which is interesting.
Where do they start?
They start with the Afrikaner self-conception. They outline how the descendants of the original Dutch, German, and Huguenot settlers viewed their own place in the world. And this is a narrative that departs drastically from the conventional historical consensus most people are familiar with.
Okay, I want to understand this foundation. What is the baseline reality the author is asking the reader to accept about the Afrikaners in 1948?
The text makes a very specific historical claim right out of the gate. The author states that, to the Afrikaners, the Cape Colony was completely uninhabited when they first arrived.
Wait, uninhabited? That is a massive claim.
It is a huge claim, yeah.
Because it completely erases the concept of colonization from their own internal narrative. I mean, if you arrive and the land is empty, you aren't a conqueror.
Right, you are a pioneer.
Exactly.
And that distinction is the cornerstone of their entire worldview, according to the essay.
So they didn't see themselves as displacing anyone initially.
Exactly. The author explains that the Afrikaners believed they only encountered indigenous African populations much later, and only as a direct result of being pushed out of the Cape by a newer wave of settlers.
The British.
Yes, the British Empire.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how they justified the events of 1948 using this specific historical lens.
It's a very particular lens.
It's almost like it's as if the author is painting a picture of a family who moves into an abandoned house, spends generations fixing it up, cultivating the land, making it their home.
A homesteading narrative.
Right. Then a wealthier, much more powerful landlord, the British Empire, shows up, kicks them out, and forces them to wander into a new neighborhood where they clash with the people already living there.
That analogy tracks perfectly with the author's framing. So when the African International Party finally clawed its way into power in 1948, establishing the systemic framework of apartheid.
They didn't see it as a bad thing.
No, they did not view it as a malicious act of supremacy. The author explicitly states that the establishment of apartheid represented a historic restoration.
A historic restoration.
Yes, and an act of justice for the Afrikaners.
Justice. Wow. They are using the word justice to describe the creation of apartheid. That is a jarring inversion of how that word is universally understood in this context.
It really is jarring.
But within the logic of the essay, justice for the Afrikaners meant self-preservation. It meant finally gaining sovereignty over their homeland and building state institutions that served their own people, rather than serving a foreign British Empire or integrating with a foreign race.
And this is where the text introduces the ideological and theological roots of this worldview, which is fascinating.
Okay, let's hear it.
The author mentions two specific concepts that formed the bedrock of this system. They call them sphere sovereignty and pluriformity.
Sphere sovereignty and pluriformity.
Yes, and they link these concepts directly to what they call an unmoderated Calvinism.
Hold on, let's slow down here. Unmoderated Calvinism. I mean, Calvinism is a major branch of Protestantism, but that word unmoderated feels like it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in the text.
Oh, it's doing a ton of heavy lifting.
What exactly is it lacking? What is it unmoderated by?
The author specifically points out that this form of Calvinism was unmoderated by the Enlightenment, or modernism more broadly.
So it completely bypassed the philosophical revolutions of the 18th century.
Exactly.
It missed out on John Locke, Rousseau, the concepts of universal human rights, radical individualism, or the innate equality of all mankind.
That is the author's exact argument, yeah. Because this theology developed in isolation, it retained a much older, rigid, and intensely tribal framework.
Interesting.
The text isn't necessarily bringing this up to condemn their faith, by the way.
No.
No, it's more to demonstrate that apartheid, at least in its idealized theoretical form, was something the Afrikaners sincerely aspired toward on a spiritual level.
A spiritual goal.
Right. Sphere sovereignty and pluriformity are essentially the beliefs that God created different ethnic, cultural, and racial groups to be distinct.
Like separate domains.
Yes, and therefore they believe they should actively work to maintain that distinctiveness.
So integration would be seen as wrong.
Exactly. In this unmoderated theological view, blending, assimilating, or creating a monolithic universal culture was viewed as a violation of a divine order.
A literal sin.
Separation wasn't just a political strategy. To them, it was the natural moral state of the world.
But theory is clean, and reality is incredibly messy.
Oh, absolutely.
It is one thing to sit in a church or a university and philosophize about the divine beauty of separate spheres. It is another thing entirely to turn that theology into the bureaucratic machinery of a modern nation-state.
And the text outlines what this actually looked like in practice.
Right.
And spoiler alert, it wasn't a peaceful parallel existence.
I would assume not.
It became a rigid, descending hierarchy of legal privileges. It formalized inequality across every facet of life.
So who is where in this hierarchy?
The author details how it functioned. At the absolute top were the Afrikaners, who structured the government and societal institutions to yield the greatest benefits for themselves.
Of course.
Below them in the hierarchy were the English-speaking settlers from Great Britain.
Even after all that animosity.
Yeah, the text notes that despite the historical animosity, the rights of the British settlers were eventually secured within the system as they were still, of European descent.
That kind of uneasy truce among the white population for the sake of maintaining the broader system.
That's a good way to put it. Further down the hierarchy, by the late 1970s and 1980s, the text notes that limited political rights were extended to colored peoples, which was the state's term for those of mixed race descent, and the Indian population.
Okay. And then the bottom.
At the absolute bottom of this highly stratified pyramid were the black tribalized Africans.
I want to focus on that specific phrase from the text for a second. Tribalized Africans.
Yeah, it's a very intentional term.
There is a very detailed footnote in the essay that goes into the government's policy of tribalizing or retribalizing the black population. It wasn't just a descriptor, it was an active aggressive verb. The state was actively tribalizing people.
Yes, they were.
Why? I mean, if the goal was simply separation, why put so much state resources into micromanaging the cultural identities of the people you are supposedly separating from?
Well, the author explains in that footnote that this was a deeply calculated mechanism of state control.
How so?
The apartheid government was terrified of a unified black identity.
I see.
They recognized that a massive, homogenized black population, especially one that might be galvanized by Pan-African nationalism or organized by communist forces, posed an existential threat to the white minority government.
So it was classic divide and conquer, but engineered on a civilizational scale.
Exactly. By actively reinforcing, funding, and in some cases artificially recreating traditional tribal divisions, the government aimed to shatter that potential unity.
Make them fight each other instead of the state.
Right. They wanted to create fractured, isolated demographic blocks. The cold political calculus was that it is infinitely easier for a centralized minority government to manage, negotiate with, and pit against one another a dozen small, distinct tribal groups than it is to govern over one unified, overwhelming majority.
Which leads us to the physical manifestation of this policy. The essay talks about the Bantustans, or the homelands.
Yes, the Bantustans.
The grand promise of apartheid, the way they sold it to themselves to satisfy that Calvinist desire for sphere sovereignty, was that they would create these independent territories for the various African tribal groups.
The theoretical goal, as presented by the state anyway, was that in these Bantustans, African communities could live according to their own customs, develop at their own pace, and enjoy localized political freedom and self-determination, completely separate from white society.
Sound like a neat little theory.
Too neat, because the author immediately pivots to expose the fatal flaw in this entire design.
And it all comes down to economics, right? It comes down to labor.
It always comes down to labor. This is a crucial moment in the essay because this is where the author admits that the system completely cannibalized its own core logic.
Interesting.
The text states that if segregation and self-determination were truly the absolute, uncompromising goals of the Bantustan system, it might have found some twisted, isolated form of success.
But they weren't.
No. Those stated intentions were almost immediately undermined by the economic appetite of the white population.
Because you can't run a booming modern economy, staff your massive agricultural farms, operate the gold and diamond mines, and maintain a high standard of living for the white minority without an enormous pool of cheap labor.
And where was that labor pool located?
In the very Bantustans they claim to be separating from.
Exactly. The author details the passbook system, which became the infamous defining mechanism of apartheid.
Right. The passbooks.
The reality of the Bantustan policy was that the white government used the passbooks and the state identification apparatus to continuously funnel black Africans out of the homelands and deep into white society to exploit them for labor.
Wait, so they wanted to keep black Africans completely out of their society, but also keep them close enough to exploit for cheap labor. It sounds like the system wanted to have its cake and eat it too, which doomed it from the start.
That is precisely what happened.
I'm trying to visualize the sheer cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system every day.
It's mind-boggling.
It's like someone claiming to be on a strict, morally righteous vegan diet, but demanding they get to live inside a functioning slaughterhouse because it's more convenient for their commute.
That's a very vivid way to put it, yeah.
You cannot claim you are building a society based on total divine pluriformity and absolute separation, and then systematically integrate the very people you claim need to be separated from you into the absolute bedrock of your economic engine.
But that's what they did.
They were monitored, their travel was severely restricted, they had no rights, but they were physically there. They were the ones building the society.
It is a glaring foundational contradiction. And the author does not shy away from this at all.
They own up to it.
Yes. The text explicitly calls the Bantustan system highly hypocritical.
Wow.
The essay acknowledges that what was sold as political apartheid, a theory of separate but autonomous development, morphed entirely into a system designed primarily to exploit and disempower the black population.
It lost the plot.
Completely. The author notes that this economic exploitation grew so vast that it eclipsed the original theoretical intent of simply securing sovereignty for the Afrikaners. It mutated into a system whose primary function appeared to be causing harm.
And the text makes a very interesting philosophical distinction here about the nature of political harm.
Oh, the part about regular politics versus structural harm.
Yeah. The author notes that in normal politics, policies designed to help one specific group will inevitably, inadvertently harm another group.
Sure. Taxes, zoning laws, things like that.
Right. It is the tragic reality of resource allocation. People generally accept that. But a system that appears intentionally, structurally designed to harm and humiliate a massive population is different. The author uses a very specific phrase. They say this reality became offensive to European sensibilities.
That phrase is the pivot point of the entire essay.
Offensive to European sensibilities.
Yes, because the author is transitioning here from the historical mechanics of apartheid to the internal psychological collapse of the people enforcing it. Because, as the text notes, it was ultimately the Afrikaners and the white South African population more broadly who came to reject the system they had built.
So what does this all mean? They didn't just lose a war, they lost their nerve.
Yes. The system had become unappealing.
Unappealing is an understatement.
Well, unappealing to them internally. It was a logistical nightmare that was failing to provide the security it promised, but more importantly, it deeply violated their own evolving moral framework.
The hypocrisy caught up to them.
Exactly. The hypocrisy of the passbook system and the brutality required to enforce it became impossible to reconcile with their self-image as a civilized, just people.
Which brings us back to that N.P. Van Wyck quote from the beginning.
Is it possible for a small folk to survive for long if it becomes hateful in the eyes of the best of its members?
We're seeing the answer play out. The system is hypocritical. It is hopelessly dependent on the people it oppresses, and the ruling class is waking up every morning feeling physically sick over what they have to do to maintain it.
And this leads the author to describe the collapse of political apartheid, not merely as a geopolitical event, but as a spiritual phenomenon.
A spiritual phenomenon.
The text calls it the dark night of the soul.
The dark night of the soul. That implies a complete loss of meaning.
Total disillusionment.
The author argues that the end of this era wasn't just a government stepping down, it was the refutation of the very essence that defined the Afrikaners as a distinct nation.
Right.
Their unique longing, their centuries-old drive for survival and sovereignty suddenly became abhorrent in their own eyes. They looked in the mirror and they despised the reflection.
The essay states that they became alienated from themselves.
Alienated from themselves.
The psychological burden of maintaining a hypocritical, brutal system simply exhausted them. And because of this profound spiritual fatigue, they largely accepted their own disempowerment.
They just folded.
They yielded to majority democratic rule, not because they were completely militarily defeated, but because they no longer believed they had the moral right to rule.
There is an important nuance the author adds here about why regimes fall. They argue that political systems and regimes collapse all the time for all sorts of reasons.
Sure. Economic ruin, bad alliances, natural disasters.
Exactly. And a system collapsing isn't always proof that the system itself was morally wrong. However, the author argues that if a system requires popular belief to sustain it, then a moral collapse is fatal.
Fatal.
In the case of apartheid South Africa, it fell because the people running it could no longer stomach the moral cost of its survival.
The author is making a profound claim here about the anatomy of power.
What's the claim?
That brute force alone is rarely sufficient to sustain a society over the long term. You need a narrative.
The justification.
Yes. You need the people manning the checkpoints, stamping the passbooks, and enforcing the laws to genuinely believe that they are the good guys doing necessary work.
And once they stop believing that?
Once that belief evaporates, the structure is hollow. The author points out that in the 1980s, the apartheid government desperately tried to reform and liberalize the system to make it more palatable.
Trying to soften the edges.
But the text compares these late-stage reforms to the dying days of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev.
I see where the author's going with that. If a system is fundamentally built on an illiberal premise, trying to introduce liberal reforms doesn't save it. It just exposes the internal contradictions even faster.
Exactly.
It's like trying to fix a sinking ship by tearing holes in the hull to let the water out. The reforms were too little, too late, and they only proved to the population how detached the government's ideology had become from reality.
Now, the text is very clear that apartheid was not a good system.
Good to clarify.
The author acknowledges that very few human beings, regardless of their background, desire to live under a sprawling bureaucratic regime that mandates identification, regulates movement, and artificially engineers society.
Even the people in charge.
Right, even if they are the ones supposedly benefiting from it.
Yeah.
The administrative burden alone is exhausting.
But the author identifies a very specific catalyst for this loss of belief, don't they?
They do.
It wasn't just internal fatigue. It was the white population's adoption of Western liberalism.
Yes.
Over the decades, as the world globalized, the white South African population increasingly identified with the broader Western world. And because they adopted the values of Western liberalism like human rights, equality, democracy, the illiberal, racially segregated policies of their own country became totally unpalatable.
They couldn't hold both ideas in their head at the same time.
South Africa became a glaring, horrific exception to the Western rule, and the resulting cognitive dissonance destroyed their will to survive as a separate entity.
But here, the author issues a very sharp caveat, and it is crucial for understanding the essay's broader political trajectory.
What's the caveat?
The author insists that acknowledging the blatant immorality and the operational failures of apartheid does not mean we must view the current state of the South African Republic under majority rule as a success.
Oh, they draw a hard line there.
A very stark distinction. The text claims that while apartheid South Africa was a failing state since its inception in 1948 due to its hypocrisy, contemporary South Africa is a failed state.
A failing state versus a failed state.
Yes.
The author is arguing that, under apartheid, the state was morally rotting and functionally doomed. But the institutions, the power grid, the courts, the infrastructure still technically operated.
Right.
Whereas today, according to the text, the actual capacity of the state to function has completely collapsed. That is a deeply pessimistic assessment of the region's trajectory.
It is, and it sets up a terrifying hypothetical in the essay.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
The author poses a thought experiment. What would it have actually taken for apartheid South Africa to survive past the 20th century?
If we assume it was a failing state, how could it have survived?
Right. If Western liberalism was the psychological virus that destroyed their resolve, what was the cure?
And what do they conclude?
The author concludes that the only way this system could have persisted would have been for the white population to completely, violently reject Western liberalism.
No, wow.
To cut themselves off from the global community and establish a hardened, militarized garrison state.
The garrison state.
And the essay uses a very specific chilling comparison. To survive, they would have had to remake themselves in the mold of North Korea.
The author is suggesting that to save their political system, they would have had to become North Korea.
Basically, yes.
Let's just sit with that argument for a second, because the sheer weight of that choice is staggering. There was no middle ground in the author's eyes.
None.
To guarantee the survival of their small volk, they would have had to become a hermit kingdom. They would have had to embrace total isolation, total militarization, and a complete rejection of the outside world's moral judgments.
They would have had to stop caring what anyone else thought.
They would have had to become a pariah state, willing to do unspeakable things without a shred of remorse. But by choosing not to do that, by choosing to remain connected to the West and to embrace a conscience, they effectively signed their own nation's death warrant. It's an impossible bind.
It is the ultimate distillation of the essay's title, Survival versus Justice.
Right, the title.
If you choose justice, if you choose your morals, you die as a sovereign nation. If you choose your survival, you have to become a monster.
That impossible bind really contextualizes the author's brief mention of a place called Orania.
Yes, Orania is a fascinating detail here.
For those unfamiliar, Orania is a real town in South Africa today, founded in 1991 by Afrikaners. It is an intentional community where only Afrikaners live and work.
Right.
The text describes Orania as the implementation of apartheid today, but in its conceptual or teleological form.
And teleological refers to the ultimate purpose or design of a thing. The author is arguing that Orania is the pure, distilled essence of what Speer sovereignty was supposed to be, completely stripped of the brutal secular and political apparatus of the old apartheid state.
So no passbooks.
No passbooks, no government oppression of a black majority, no massive police state. It is simply a group of people choosing to separate themselves, to preserve their culture, doing all their own labor without ruling over anyone else.
But the author doesn't frame Orania as a triumphant victory for the Afrikaner people, do they?
Not at all.
No.
The author acknowledges that the individuals in Orania physically survive. But the text states that the national body, the sovereign power, and the wealth and shall,
The worldview.
right, the comprehensive dominant worldview of the Afrikaner nation is gone forever. They exist as a remnant, an artifact.
Which brings us to the hinge of the entire essay. Up until this point, the author has been providing a highly specific, deeply unorthodox post-mortem of South African history.
A very detailed postmortem.
But the essay isn't a history paper. It is a warning.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yes, please.
the author uses the Afrikaner experience as a diagnostic tool to examine the rest of the world. The text states, "What apartheid South Africa demonstrates is that if a population of European stock is forced to choose between survival and justice, justice will prevail."
And we must be clear about how the author is using the word prevail here.
Definitely.
They do not mean it as a happy ending. They do not mean that justice will triumphantly lead the nation into a brighter future.
No, not at all.
They mean that the desire for justice will overpower the instinct for survival. The moral compass will become so demanding, so unforgiving, that it will steer the ship directly into the rocks.
And the author explicitly pivots from the southern tip of Africa to the modern West.
The U.S.? Europe?
Yes. They argue that this exact same psychological dynamic, this fatal infection of moral guilt, is currently destroying Canada, Europe, and the United States.
Wow.
They claim that the script that played out in Pretoria in the 1980s is playing out in Ottawa, London, and Washington right now.
The text focuses heavily on Canada as the prime example of this modern crisis, doesn't it?
It does. The author introduces the concept of white old stock Canadians.
Old stock Canadians.
Right, and they argue that this demographic is currently being relentlessly castigated and shamed for their history. The essay provides a specific, comprehensive list of the areas where this castigation occurs, which effectively mirrors the modern progressive critique of Western civilization.
Let's walk through that list because it shows exactly how broad the author thinks this moral rot is. What are the specific sins that these old stock Canadians are being told they must answer for?
The author lists their history regarding the displacement and treatment of indigenous tribes,
Okay.
their historical treatment of sexual minorities,
Right.
their reliance on resource exploitation and its effect on the climate,
The environment.
and the historical, political, and cultural place of women in their society.
It is essentially a checklist of every major social justice movement of the last 50 years.
Basically, yes.
And the author's argument is that by accepting these critiques, by agreeing that their ancestors were fundamentally unjust in how they treated minorities, women, and the environment, modern Western populations are internalizing a profound civilizational guilt.
A guilt that destroys them from the inside.
The text argues that the resulting cultural mindset is this: we were unjust, therefore we must have multiculturalism, denounce our ancestors, and ultimately fade away so as to atone for our sins.
And this is where the psychological analysis in the text deepens significantly. The author argues that a society takes its cues from its leaders.
The intelligentsia.
Exactly. Once a population is viewed as evil or fundamentally flawed in the eyes of its own intelligentsia, its academics, its media, its political class, the everyday people begin to internalize that view.
It trickles down.
The narrative shifts of "we made mistakes" to "our existence is a mistake." And a people that believes its own existence is a moral negative cannot biologically or culturally sustain itself.
The author draws a direct causal line between this internalized guilt and tangible demographic collapse.
Yes, the physical decline of the population.
They list the symptoms of this societal depression: declining birth rates, a pervasive culture of self-refutation, and the active adoption of foreign cultures because they are perceived as more authentic, moral, or innocent than one's own.
The logic the author is employing here is that reproduction requires a fundamental optimism about your own identity.
You have to believe your culture is worth passing on.
Right. If you are taught that your ancestors ruined the planet and oppressed the vulnerable, bringing a child into the world, continuing that specific lineage, feels like an act of arrogance or even violence.
So the demographic decline isn't just an economic phenomenon.
According to the text, no. It is a subconscious act of penance. It is national self-flagellation.
I really want to pause and wrestle with the author's premise here because this is where the text makes its most massive leaps.
It's a huge leap.
The author claims that justice is becoming the enemy of survival. But we have to ask, as the reader, how is the author defining survival here?
That's the core question.
Are they talking about biological survival, meaning the literal physical extinction of people? Or are they talking about the survival of a very specific, rigid cultural dominance?
That distinction is paramount when analyzing this text. The author seems to heavily conflate cultural dominance or demographic hegemony with literal survival.
Right.
Let's consider the Canadian example the author provides. If an old-stock Canadian embraces multiculturalism, acknowledges historical injustices, and lives in a diverse neighborhood, they aren't physically dying.
No.
Their bloodline might continue, their family might thrive, their community might evolve into something new, but the author frames this evolution, this loss of exclusive dominance, as annihilation.
Exactly. To the author, existing merely as a participant in a broader, diverse society, rather than the undisputed sovereign of that society, is not true survival.
It's just like how they viewed the Afrikaners in Orania.
They physically exist, but because they lost the nation-state, they are practically dead.
Yes. The text asserts that existing in a state of constant apology, demographic decline, and cultural dilution is a slow spiritual death.
The author writes that, as our societies decline, it seems that those who rule over us are determined to force that choice upon us, thus rendering justice the enemy of survival.
And this fear, this absolute conviction that Western nations will simply cease to exist because they are too paralyzed by their own moral guilt to defend their borders, their demographics, or their cultural supremacy, drives the author to search for a solution.
So, does the author actually offer a way out of this trap? Or is the essay just a diagnosis of terminal decline?
Well, the author does offer a solution,
Yeah.
but it is one that requires completely abandoning the foundational political architecture of the modern Western world.
Okay.
The author writes that they hope justice and survival do not have to be mutually exclusive forever. They hope a nation can maintain its morality, or at least its perception of its own morality, while still doing the ruthless, necessary things required to secure its borders and its future. But they state unequivocally that this balance is impossible under a democratic system.
Why? What is the specific mechanism within democracy that makes survival impossible in the author's view?
The author applies a deeply theological framework to the concept of democratic governance.
Theology again.
Always back to theology with this text. In a democracy, the state derives its power from the consent of the governed. The government's actions are, systematically and philosophically, the actions of the entire population.
The state is the avatar of the people.
Exactly. Therefore, if a democratic state does something ruthless, unjust, or cruel to ensure its survival, say violently repelling migrants or enforcing draconian cultural assimilation laws, the entire nation bears the moral guilt of those actions.
The text calls it collective sin.
Yes.
Because everyone voted for the system, everyone's hands are dirty when the system acts brutally.
And the essay is explicit about the consequences of this. The text states that collective sin, by necessity, requires collective punishment.
Drawing heavily on biblical phrasing there.
Very heavily. The author writes that if the wages of sin are death, then a sinful nation bound up in democracy must die.
So the guilt of the unjust actions required for survival will infect the entire population,
Rotting them from the inside out.
triggering that exact same spiritual exhaustion that destroyed the Afrikaners.
Precisely.
So we arrive at the ultimate problem. How do you bypass collective sin? How does a nation do the ugly, violent, necessary work of survival without destroying its own soul in the process?
The author's solution is both ancient and radical.
They argue for the return of an individual ruler.
A monarch.
A king.
Yes. The text argues that the only way to separate the survival of the state from the moral purity of the people is to sever the democratic link between them.
Okay, I see.
An individual leader ruling by divine right or absolute authority acts singularly. His actions reflect his will alone, not the will of the populace.
So the people aren't responsible.
Therefore, only the monarch can commit the necessary injustices for the sake of the nation's survival without implicating the citizens in that sin.
Let me try to visualize the mechanics of this with an analogy, because it is a very alien concept to the modern democratic mind.
It's very alien. Yeah, go ahead.
Imagine a remote village that is facing a brutal winter. They have run out of food. The only way the village will survive the winter is if they cross the river and steal the winter stores from a neighboring, weaker village.
A clear choice between survival and justice.
Right. Now, if this village is a democracy, they hold a town hall. They debate it, they vote on it, and the majority decides they must steal to survive. The men of the village march across the river together, attack their neighbors, and take the food.
Okay.
They survive the winter. But now every single person in that village is a thief. Every time they look at their neighbors, every time they look at their own children, they know that their existence is bought with the suffering of innocent people.
The collective guilt.
The guilt permeates the entire culture. The village survives physically, but spiritually they begin to despise themselves.
But consider the alternative the author is presenting. What if that village is ruled by a king?
Exactly. So the author is basically arguing for a political sin eater.
Oh, sin eater.
In a democracy, if the country does something ruthless to survive, everyone's hands are dirty, and the culture collapses from guilt. But a king can get his hands dirty, carry that spiritual burden alone, and let the people keep their hands clean.
If the village has a king, the town doesn't vote. The king sees the winter coming. He secretly orders his personal specialized guard to cross the river in the dead of night, slaughter the neighbors, and steal the food.
And
The next morning, the king distributes the grain to his people. He might tell them he bought it, or found it, or perhaps the people just choose not to ask too many questions.
plausible deniability.
The village survives the winter, but the people get to keep their hands clean. They get to maintain their innocence. The king gets his hands dirty. He becomes the political sin eater, as you said.
He absorbs the moral poison required for survival so the populace doesn't have to.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the profound, almost Machiavellian theological argument the text makes at its conclusion.
It's wild to think about.
The author states that the monarch sacrifices his own standing with God, risking his own eternal salvation by committing the unjust acts necessary to protect the realm.
Wow.
But crucially, the text argues that while a singular ruler can eventually repent on an individual level, seeking absolution from God, a massive democratic nation cannot collectively repent.
Because it's a structure, not a soul.
Right. A democracy cannot ask for forgiveness for its structural existence. The king can take the moral hit, save the nation, and carry the burden alone. The democracy simply collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy.
It is an incredibly dark, almost cynical view of leadership. The leader doesn't exist to represent the goodness of the people. The leader exists to damn themselves so the people can pretend to be good.
And the author leaves breadcrumbs for the reader to explore this further.
The footnotes.
Yes. The text includes 2 specific footnotes at the very end that reveal the intellectual circles this essay is drawing from.
Let's talk about those.
Footnote 2 references a piece called The Pagan Nature of Power.
The pagan nature of power.
And the text also casually recommends a YouTube video by a creator named Apostolic Majesty regarding the history of apartheid.
Those footnotes are incredibly revealing. They act as a bibliography for a very specific reactionary worldview.
Absolutely. The pagan nature of power suggests an ideology that argues political power cannot ever be truly Christian or universally moral.
It's fundamentally incompatible with true morality.
Power, by its very definition, requires a certain ruthless pagan utility. It requires force, exclusion, and violence. You cannot govern a state using the Sermon on the Mount.
And by invoking a creator called Apostolic Majesty, the author is clearly aligning with the neo-reactionary, traditionalist, and monarchist corners of modern political thought.
Very clearly.
The essay is literally arguing that a nation might become so terrified of its own demise and yet so desperate to maintain its illusion of moral purity that it will willingly repudiate democracy so that its justice can be preserved while its survival is ensured.
They will tear down the voting booths and install a dictator just to survive the psychological guilt of existence.
It is a stunning, terrifying escalation of logic.
It really is.
The essay starts with a very localized, unorthodox historical grievance regarding the Afrikaners in South Africa and extrapolates it into a grand, unified theory of civilizational collapse, ending with a call for monarchist revival in the modern West.
Let's trace the path of this logic one last time, because we have covered an immense amount of difficult terrain today.
We really have. So we started with the Afrikaner self-conception, their foundational belief that they arrived at an empty cape, meaning they were indigenous pioneers, not colonizers.
Right.
This allowed them to frame the establishment of political apartheid in 1948 not as oppression, but as a restoration of justice against the British Empire that had displaced them.
And we then explored how their unmoderated Calvinist theology of sphere sovereignty and pluriformity was put into practice through a rigid hierarchy and the creation of the Bantustans.
But we saw how that desire for complete separation was immediately and fatally undermined by the white population's reliance on cheap black labor.
The economic reality destroyed the theory.
Right. Enforced by the brutal daily reality of the passbook system and the state's intentional strategy of tribalizing black identities to prevent unified resistance.
From there, we mapped the psychological fallout, the dark night of the soul.
The apartheid system didn't just fail because of international sanctions or demographic math. It fell because it became abhorrent to the very people running it.
As they adopted Western liberalism, the hypocrisy became a spiritual poison.
Yeah.
Because they refused the only other alternative, becoming a militarized, isolated garrison state like North Korea.
And finally, we followed the author's leap from the collapse of South Africa to the current state of the modern West.
The essay argues that old stock Canadians and modern Europeans are currently suffering from the exact same spiritual virus.
By accepting the progressive critiques of their history regarding indigenous tribes, sexual minorities, climate change, and gender, they have internalized a paralyzing guilt.
And the author claims this guilt leads directly to demographic decline, a culture of self-refutation, and ultimately civilizational death.
And their proposed escape route from this democratic death spiral is the repudiation of democracy itself in favor of a singular monarch who can absorb the sins of survival, leaving the nation's conscience artificially clean.
It is a profound, challenging, and highly controversial thought experiment.
But this is exactly why we take the time to put texts like this under the microscope. We don't read them to adopt their conclusions. We read them because they force us to examine the foundational myths of our own societies.
Exactly.
This essay, stripped of its historical specificities, poses a universal dilemma. What is the price we are genuinely willing to pay for our survival?
And conversely, what is the exact cost we are willing to endure to maintain our morality?
When push comes to shove, are we willing to sacrifice one for the other?
This raises an important question, and I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
I'd love to hear it.
It builds directly on the author's logic regarding this proposed monarch. If the author truly believes that a nation requires a singular king to absorb all the sins and violence necessary for the state to survive, does that imply that true moral purity within a general population is actually just a luxury?
A luxury.
Is innocence just a luxury good that can only be afforded by people who have successfully outsourced the dirty, ruthless, bloody work of survival to someone else?
Oh, wow.
It suggests that the feeling of innocence on a national scale is nothing more than a carefully engineered illusion.
So you look in the mirror to check your moral compass, and you realize the glass is actually a one-way mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
And standing in the dark on the other side is someone else quietly doing the terrible things you refuse to do just so you can keep looking at yourself.
A haunting image to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive into the sources. We wish you well, and we'll see you next time.